Military food services today are increasingly responsive to such dietary issues as vegetarianism and keeping kosher. Gentlemen, will you please share with us some of the challenges that you have faced with following Jewish dietary tradition in the very complex military environments in which you've served?
There's very little challenge there, I have to say, but hard rations are hard rations. And I remember we were on joint exercise with the French and Belgium in Africa one time. And what we got to do was we got to look at everybody's hard rations. What did they get? And of course, the French had fantastic cheese in their hard rations. Hard rations with cheese, like brie. I mean, I couldn't believe that. And then the Portuguese, they had sardines, but real sardines, not like desiccated, dehydrated sardines. So it was interesting to taste everybody else's foods. And I always think the Canadian Forces, always says, you know, they say the Canadian Forces, the Army runs on its stomach. When I was in Afghanistan, the food that was served there was unbelievable. And I'm telling you that it was fantastic. I had nothing to complain about when I was at base. Because at the base, they had cooks who were working and dedicated to giving you the best of everything. And food would come in all the time. So my only story was that one story about hard rations and kosher and halal, but otherwise the food was A1.
As far as I was concerned, we couldn't get any food that would be passable to a rabbi, so I just had to say to myself, I bless the food and call it what I wanted. But I had to eat whatever I was given, otherwise I was starved.
There's a story from the Shtetlach when the Russian army in the time of the Tsar would come to the villages and take Jewish boys away to serve 20 or 25 years, essentially a death sentence. And in this shtetl, a number of boys got their orders, and they went to see the rabbi, and they said, "Rabbi, what are we going to do? All they serve is pork." And the rabbi said, "You have to do what you have to do to survive, but don't suck the bones." So an accommodation that I managed, that had to do for some years, was I wouldn't eat anything that couldn't be kosher. That's kind of a negative approach to it, but if it couldn't be made kosher, I wouldn't eat it. So there were times, particularly when we were serving in Germany, that I would survive an awful lot on peanut butter sandwiches. At home was no problem. I had a beautiful, beautiful kosher kitchen that Sharon maintained from the day we were married and through today. And, you know, there were some sort of side benefits, like there was a period where the seat beside me at the mess dinner, the fancy dinners that our units would put on a couple of times a year, was always hotly contested who would sit beside me, because they get 2 shrimp cocktails instead of the 1. Now the combat ration that appeared before, while I was still serving, got to use it a number of times. It was kosher, it was halal, and it was vegetarian. So you can imagine what was in it. Not very much. And I was on exercise one time up in northern Manitoba, and I'd been chatting with the soldiers, and I went off to have lunch and had one of these kosher, halal, vegetarian rations. And then I went down the road a bit and found a young soldier who I learned was a Muslim. and he was eating stuff that his mother wouldn't have wanted him to eat. And I said, but Mohammed, there's halal rations there. He said, and this is a big boy. He was a big boy. And he said, sir, I know they're there, but I gotta have my meat.
So sometimes, sometimes, just to be passable, I will eat some fish. So here I am invited to the armory up the hill on Côte-des-Neiges for a mess dinner. And everybody's having their roast beef or their chicken or whatever. And I say, well, I don't really eat any of that stuff. I do eat occasionally fish. So about 15 minutes later, they bring me a plate that has that salad, and in the middle is an overturned can of tuna. State of the art.
They tried.
They tried.
I'm going to take the privilege of being the moderator just to add one small vignette for something that I feel rather guilty. A number of years ago, General Fitch was the guest of honor at my regiment's annual officers' mess dinner. And knowing that the general is an observant man, I made sure that the menu would contain nothing that, as he said, that he could not eat. The main course, the dessert, everything was well organized. I felt confident. The general, my guest of honor, seated beside me. The first course arrives, and as described, it was a salad. A salad with 2 lovely large shrimps right on top. And with aplomb, the general delicately removed the 2 shrimps, put them aside, and enjoyed his salad and the rest of the meal.
Now, we live in a society that's always so super strict about everything. But years ago, and this goes to his credit, as well as Toby Glickman, who was also the CO, that we had in this armory, I don't know if we could get the generals to agree on this at this time, but at that time we had a 3rd Seder. In this armory, we were dressed in our mess finery, and we ate matzah, and we talked about it, and we sat around, and thanks to Rick and Toby, who were then the CO and DCO of the unit, every Jew that we knew of was invited to come, and we had some people who were from the Second World War at that time, goes back a little bit, and we had a few of the newer people, and that was a very nice event that we talked about for a long time afterwards.
And if memory serves, you've shared much too much wine with all of us. Thank you.
Memory serves. Kosher wine.
It was. Each of you have served in the reserves or have been intimately associated with the reserves in addition to your full-time service. If I can ask if you experienced any unique issues as Jews in the reserve context.
It wasn't exactly as a Jew, but in a reserve context, it's not a full-time job. And the challenge is to get time off from work to be deployed properly. And I always found that there was a bit of a challenge. I had to switch on calls, I had to switch, get the prolongation of what I was doing to say, oh, I'm going to take your call when I come back, please take my call when I'm away. And that really was, for me, one of the biggest challenges. But being as a Jew and saying, oh, being in the reserves was a challenge, no, I didn't find that at that time.
In the reserves, and I was in the reserves for 38 years before I was an honorary colonel for 40 years. I never really had any problem because that I can recall, there were some guys who probably didn't show it overtly, but they may have had anti-Semitic issues covertly, but I wouldn't know about it because it never came to me as far as I was concerned. And I had a lot of friends in the Army because, as I said before, my brother and Eddie and I were the only Jews in our unit. And I don't think we had any of those problems as far as I was concerned. But the example that I gave you from General Prieur back in '62 might have been one of the covert things. But aside from that, I never actually experienced any problem of that type.
Richard, I'm actually going to pass on this one. I was kind of an accidental reservist and never did belong to a reserve unit. It was a convenience of the career managers at the time. So, I think my comments serving in the regular force apply the same way.
Padres in the military serve all faiths. Would you share with us your most memorable interactions with Padres?
Well, I was lucky when I was serving in Cyprus with the United Nations that the Padre there was well versed in the history and geography of Cyprus. Because the blue beret, and I brought my blue beret, which is the one that I wore at that time. I put it there just to show and tell like we do in elementary school. So he was so well versed that whenever, and I was alternating as the MO, as the medical officer, with a British territorial medical officer. There were just two of us, but sometimes we had a weekend off or a day off. And he would say, come with me, Marcus, we're going to go see whatever city he wanted to see, from Augusta, Nicosia, everything we would visit. And we'd go to the Turkish side, we would go to the Greek side, and it was like, he really was like a font of knowledge, and he taught me so much about the church as it existed in Cyprus, not regular stuff. And he was a Protestant chaplain, but he was well versed. And for me, that was one of the most memorable experiences. When I was in Afghanistan, it was a little bit different. Because in Afghanistan, the Padre there, he faced a lot of, they were almost like Dear John situations. He would see a lot of soldiers who would say, I just got this letter from my wife, and she's not my wife anymore, she's walking away from me. And they would be devastated because they're so far away, there's nothing they could do to control the situation. And oftentimes we would talk if there's anything we could do, myself as an MO, him as the Padre. And that was another type of close contact that I had with the Padres.
The only Padre that I had, it's off now. The only Padre that I really had contact with while I was in the active service was Rabbi Gershon Levy. But when I was in the Reserve Army after the war, I was helping with some of the Jewish branch of the Legion, and Rabbi Samuel Cass was the Padre of the Jewish Padre of the Legion at that time, and I had a lot to do with him from time to time. And he was a very good man, and I enjoyed him very much.
We can bridge a gap here. I was a young man about the time I joined the Army, but Rabbi Cass was a friend of my dad's, and I got to meet him and hear some of the stories. He was a man of great stature. Yep. And indeed, my father was a little bit irreverent with him at times and asked if he got poles with the skis when with his shoes. They were pretty big. The Jews in the Canadian Army, Canadian Armed Forces in World War II were well served by a remarkable team of Jewish chaplains, including a cousin in my family, Julius Berger.
Married me.
I married my parents as well. And he officiated at my father's bar mitzvah as well. That all Jewish chaplains were released in 1945. And it was in my last years serving in Ottawa at National Defence Headquarters when I had an opportunity to contribute to, well, things were changing in the Canadian Forces. They wanted to be different. And I made a representation to the committee that coordinates the activities of all chaplains in the Canadian Armed Forces. And at that time, they were all Christian, several different denominations. And the way they determined how many of each there would be was if there were 500 of a denomination, they would get a chaplain. So where were the Jews? Well, they weren't sure if there were 500 Jews in the armed forces. So the theme of my presentation to this committee was, do you want to follow or do you want to lead? And that struck a chord. And it was one of those, if we build it, perhaps they will come. And they decided to install a Jewish chaplain. And I'm proud to say it was a friend of ours, Rabbi Chaim Mendelson of Ottawa, was the first Jewish chaplain in the Canadian Army since 1945. He was a reservist, served for a few years. Today we have a full-time chaplain in the regular force, Rabbi Danziger. And I understand Rabbi Danziger convened a minyan at Wainwright a few weeks ago for a Shabbat service. So that's was a long time coming, but that's back again. There may be another Jewish chaplain. I've heard of another, but I don't have the details. And indeed, there is at least one, maybe more, Muslim chaplains.
Does anybody mind if I open the window on the site for
Just to build on your comment, General, my son recently left Royal Military College, where there is an imam, and 2 years ago, when Passover was approaching, my son went to talk to the imam and said, there are a number of us here, the Jewish faith. Is there anything that you could do to organize to support us having a proper Passover service? And the imam took it on himself to go to approach the local community in Kingston, met up with the rabbi, made arrangements that this group of, it was a minion, about 12 or 13, young Jewish officer cadets went, accompanied by the Muslim imam, to participate in a Seder. So yes, we have gone full circle in many ways.
If I can just add a comment, it would be unfair if I didn't mention how well served I was over the years by a number of Christian chaplains. One in particular, when I was commanding Western area, that's a piece of land that goes from Thunder Bay to Vancouver Island. My staff would enjoy telling me that it's the largest military district in the world. We were about 12,000 regular, reserve, and civilians in that command at the time. And as commander, you get a number of specialist advisors. So there's military police, provost marshal. There's a surgeon, the senior medical officer for the command. There'd be a senior legal officer. And of course there was a command or an area chaplain as well, but somehow I knew the others would always be bringing me problems. I would see them often enough because there'd be problems to be dealing with. I was concerned I wouldn't see the chaplain. So he was the only one with whom I had a regular monthly meeting, regardless of whether we thought there was an issue to discuss or not. Those meetings never went under an hour. And I enlisted him to be my ethics watchdog. As an expert in ethics, I asked him to watch me, and if he saw me doing anything that might even be perceived to be less than wholly ethical, then he was to advise me and I would correct it. Another chaplain I enjoyed very much, a guy named Dave Kettle. When he was a captain, he was my regimental chaplain when I had my first command. He was the chaplain with a bayonet in his teeth. He was so keen, and the soldiers just loved him for it. And he finished his career as the chaplain general of the Canadian Forces, a very distinguished service indeed.
Which reminds me of protocol. You know, we always know about attached bayonets to rifles, but there's two groups who don't attach bayonets to rifles. One of them doesn't even carry a rifle. And the chaplains don't carry, and the doctors do, because we are there to protect our patients, and we are there to protect, and we're trained, but we never attach bayonets.
Gentlemen, the last question, if I may. What role did your being a Jew play in your decision to join the Canadian Army?
I must confess very little. I was already in practice, and I was, like they euphemistically would say, I was looking for a hobby. And I saw this announcement in the JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association, of an orthopedic surgeon who was on the U.S. Reserves. So my mind started thinking, is there such a thing in Canada? I had no knowledge. I really had no knowledge. I had not gone to cadet school. I had not done any of that stuff. And so I sort of sent a letter to Ottawa. And they said, yeah, if you want, go down to Saint Jean d'Iberville. I said, I don't think so. So I didn't. But about 6 months later, I get a phone call from the honorary lieutenant colonel of the unit, of the medical unit, saying, I sort of heard rumors you might be interested. I said, yeah, I sort of am, but it's been 6 months since I sort of sent that letter to Ottawa. He said, well, let's go for lunch. So we went out for lunch, and he said, look, I know you have no background. You're a complete neophyte. But we do need MOs, we do need medical officers in our unit. So come down, look at what we do, look at the exercises that we are participating in, and if you're interested, we'll go forward. And what can I tell you? I was interested, and I stayed in there 21 odd years, enjoyed every minute of it, and was, after when I was discharged finally, my regret was I didn't do more, because I really, really found it to be one of the most outstanding organizations in Canada. So,
my involvement was a little different. First of all, I had my brother Paul, had been in the high school cadets, and had become the commanding officer as a major. And when I joined my high school, I joined the cadets 13 years of age. And my brother Eddie, when he came to Montreal High, also joined the cadets. But we had a background in the family, because I had two cousins of mine who were in World War I. My cousin Paul Ironstone was a military doctor, and he served in World War I. And his older brother, Mo Ironstone, was a pilot in World War I as well. So we had sort of them to follow through. And then I also had my brother Paul, who started as a boy signaler with the artillery back in 1938. So it really wasn't that difficult for us to join. But my mother was very adamant. She said having Paul in the Army was enough. but Eddie and I couldn't join, so we didn't join the army until after my mother passed away in 1937, and then we got to the Signal Corps and joined up then. And of course, with Hitler stewing in Germany the way he was, it wasn't a very hard thing for us to want to volunteer anyway, because I wanted to do something about the fact that we had to defeat the Germans.
Richard, I forgot what the question was, but I did note that we've had these kind people sitting here for over an hour, so I'll pass.
That's 2 passes. He plays bridge. Tova, do we have time for any questions from the audience, or are we on schedule to depart to the reception?
I think, why don't we take 2 or 3 questions?
Okay, so do you, sir?
For Colonel Hart, when you were serving during the war, how familiar were you about the Holocaust taking place simultaneously?
We didn't get much information on that. I knew that some of it was happening, but I didn't hear very much. But all I wanted to do was, because I knew that terrible things were happening to the Jews in camps, that I wanted to get into action and see what we could do against them.
Were you involved at all in the liberation of concentration camps? Were you involved at all in the liberation of concentration camps?
No, I wasn't. Some of my friends were, though, and they were, one in particular was in charge of a liberation of a camp in Belgium, and he was absolutely appalled at what he found, and he told me about it. He was Major Don McLean. He was a very nice guy, and he was a great guy. He told me how terrible it was when he got into the camp and saw all those people.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it known how many Jews are serving in the Canadian Forces today?
I see a hand up amongst the panel members.
I'm not going to pass on this one.
It's a very interesting question. There's one person who knows, and he can't tell. And here's why. It's about the personal information can only be used for the purpose for which it is gathered. So on the enlistment form, there's a place to write down what your religion is. You're allowed to put no religion expressed, NRE, if you want. But if you express a religion, it goes into that count of how many of each kind are there to figure out how many chaplains to have. And it can also be used if you become a casualty, they know which kind of chaplain to send to your family, God forbid, that kind of thing. So the number is aggregated only for use by the chaplain general, and he is not permitted to use that number for other reasons. So I have to estimate by encounters with Jews, and I would estimate several hundreds, probably less than 1,000.
Sir.
I would ask
You always turn it off. I'd like to add one thing about my service during the war. When I got my dog tags, as General Fitch was saying, you could state what you wanted. And I said that I wanted to have Hebrew on there, and they said, why? The Germans will kill you. I said, let them know that a Jew is coming to get after them.
But if you do go to Beechwood Military Cemetery in Ottawa, you will see a lot of gravestones that have a Mogan David on them.
And in the Dieppe Cemetery as well.
Yeah, but this is in Ottawa, so you can just walk by there, Beechwood
And you
Military
can see them
Cemetery.
in the exhibit outside as well.
Sir.
I was going to ask all the panelists, what has been the biggest changes in the military that you've been experienced, or that you've heard of since your particular service? And I understand in the American Army there are selective units where women are now able to serve on a volunteer basis. But what has been, in your opinion, the biggest changes in the Canadian military since you served, and what surprised you the most?
I didn't.
You didn't see it?
The Canadian Army's had women at least since the Northwest Rebellion, 1885, every conflict since then, far more numerous in recent decades, far more percentage-wise, I believe. I haven't kept track of it now, but we were admitting women to virtually every occupation long before the Americans dreamed of it.
I'm referring specifically to combat roles.
So am I. And I served with some very excellent, very capable, very courageous women in Yugoslavia and other places.
We had that famous captain.
In Afghanistan, the first female casualty in battle since 1945 there was a woman captain killed sadly in Afghanistan. So don't take the Americans as an example. The Canadian government knows that they have total control over the Canadian Armed Forces. So you take one of the most conservative organizations in the country and you make it the leading edge of social change, and you know what? The Army does that for you. We're an example of what Canada can be. Very proud of my Army for that.
When we were serving in Afghanistan, and I had a lot of medics who were with me, aiding me, wherever we had to go transport, whatever we had to do, be it on patrol, be it whatever, I would say that the majority of the medics who were with me in Afghanistan were female.
And on a very personal note, if I can say, this is not anything new. In the Second World War, my mother served with General Fitch's aunt, well, with Sharon's aunt. This is not a new thing.